ask you something. Have you ever found yourself entangled in a childhood lie that just haunts you forever? Something that seemed so innocent at the time? Well, before we get there, you're probably wondering why I'm wearing all of these beads, right? And so before anyone asks, I didn't get these from Mardi Gras, and I'm not going to be passing these out tonight, so everyone, keep your shirts on. I'm an area director for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and these are what we call honor beads. Now, for those of you who have ever been to an Out of the Darkness walk before, you're probably pretty familiar with these. But for those of you who haven't, each color signifies a different type of loss or a connection to the cause. And so today, I'm wearing the blue beads to show my support to suicide prevention efforts. I'm also wearing the teal beads to honor all of those who I know personally and through this work who have struggled and or attempted suicide. And I'm also wearing the purple beads to honor a friend of mine who I lost to suicide just 2 weeks prior to heading off to college. And at the time, talking about suicide was so stigmatized that I felt like I had no one that I could talk to. I felt like I had no one that I could turn to. I didn't even know if I could say it was a suicide. And how would you feel moving forward without one of your closest friends right before entering this new phase of life? Well, I can tell you that I felt pretty alone. But now I know that I'm not alone. I know that statistically speaking, 50% of all of you listening today have been impacted by suicide in some way. You see, suicide doesn't discriminate. It doesn't have a race. It doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have a sexual orientation or a socioeconomic status or an age group. It's the 10th leading cause of death in our nation. Yet, the good news is that most people who are thinking about taking their life are ambivalent on acting on it, and most people show signs. And so what that tells me is that there is hope, that people want to be seen, and that although it's one of the leading causes of death, it's actually the most preventable. So let's go back to that childhood lie that I was talking about for a second. Now, I'm going to be changing the names in this story to protect the people and the families involved, but one of my best friends, let's just call her Alyssa, had lied to her parents and said that she was going to be staying at my house so that she could stay at a different friend's house, who her parents just didn't really approve of. I mean, we've all been there, right? Well, I didn't know that this lie was told until the next day when my mom gets a phone call from Alyssa's mom. And Alyssa's mom asked if she could talk to Alyssa. My mom said, well, she isn't here right now. And she said, well, if Alyssa isn't there, then does Louisa know where she is? Because she said she's with Louisa. So my mom comes running up the stairs, and I wake up to her ripping the comforter off of me and handing me the house phone. I had no idea why this phone was in my hand. Hello? Alyssa's mom? What can I do for you? Well, Alyssa said that she was with you, so do you happen to know where she is? So I told her the truth. I'm sorry, but I have no idea where she is. See, it was 2004, and not everyone had a cell phone or a pager. Alyssa didn't have either of those. So we tried calling every single one of her friends that we could think of. No one knew where she was. Then all of a sudden, the police come knocking on her parents' door, and they say that they have identified Alyssa's body and that she had tragically passed. When all of a sudden, walking through the door comes Alyssa. I had gripped my house phone, waiting for that call from Alyssa's mom. And man, did it feel good to get that good news that she was home and that she was safe. But you know, the second that I felt the sweat on my palms start to dry up from that good news, I then got another phone call saying that the person who the police had mistakenly identified as Alyssa was actually my other friend, Jen, and that Jen had taken her life. You see, at the time of my loss, we didn't have all of the technology that we do today. Today, we have the ability to instantly reach out and locate someone. And I mean, sure, we live in a time period where we are just oversaturated with technology, and it has the tendency to isolate us. But we have to start understanding how we can use technology for good, because for some, it could be a lifeline. Now, as a culture, we have become smarter and better about having mental health conversations, but there is always room for improvement. And when we normally talk about warning signs, we talk about them in the guise of in-person human interaction, mood patterns, behavioral changes. And when you take the last 2 years and the pandemic, there has been so much tragedy and hardships that have happened, and we were forced as a society to drastically transition almost our entire lives online. That created a lot of opportunities for us, but it also created a lot of challenges. We have seen people experiencing higher degrees of anxiety. But data and research has shown us that the overall rate of suicide has gone down 3% since 2019. We also know that more people are connected to mental health treatment now than ever before. In fact, 26% of the public is connected to a therapist now via telehealth. That's amazing. And so what the challenge becomes is, do we know how to look for warning signs in this digital space? When we don't have the physical cues like tone of voice or facial expressions. So thinking about text messages, social media, Zoom, how do we tune in to what people are actually saying when we don't have those physical cues? Well, I think we need to listen a little bit more, right? We also need to be smarter and better about reading in between the lines. And in order to do so, we need to listen. Truthfully, I think what the world needs is more listeners. But listening isn't just always about hearing. It's also about watching out for subtle nuances in the digital space, because someone could be dropping hints just hoping that someone is picking up on them. Here's what I mean. If someone who is normally posting a lot on social media, and now all of a sudden they're not posting anything, or if someone who normally is immediate at texting you back, now all of a sudden is taking a long time to respond and only giving you minimal responses. Or what about if someone who is showing up on Zoom looking fresh all of the time now is showing up looking like they haven't showered or taken as good of care of their personal hygiene? Lean into any of those signs. You see, EQ also involves leaning in to empathy. Brené Brown says that empathy is a skill that tends to bring people together and make them feel connected, while sympathy tends to create this uneven power dynamic that usually leads to isolation and disconnection. Empathy and listening are both skills, and just like any other skill, we need to practice. So how do we practice? Well, we can do so simply by doing what we're doing here today, which is just starting a conversation. You just have to know how. But let's not overthink it. Go with whatever comes up first. Hi, how are you? How have you been? You see, I used to work with foster youth, and I wasn't so much of the frontline staff side, more as I was on the developmental side of the organization. But some of the youth had told me that I was their favorite staff. And for a while, I couldn't figure out what it was that I was doing that made them think that I was the best. Until one day, a youth named Jasmine came up to me, and she came from a background that was filled with trauma, filled with abuse, and she often struggled with suicidal ideations and attempts. And she said to me, "You know what, Louisa? You just treat me like a human. You just ask me questions about my day. You always care about what I'm doing and how my day is going. And you compliment me on my outfits," which she had some pretty great style, so she deserved it. But what that showed me is that all it took to make me the best in her eyes was just these simple humanizing statements. And what that also showed me is that empathy fuels connection and attunement, and it just feels good. So let's all practice by thinking about a recent conversation that we had with a family member or friend about a bad day that they had. What did they say to you? How did you react? What did you say back? What do you wish that you would have said differently? I think it's really important that we talk about what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And so think back to that conversation again, and think about what it is that they're saying to you. Think about what it really is that they're saying to you. And ask yourself how that makes you feel. And what is it exactly that that person needs? You see, empathy and listening can both be proactive and reactive tools. Suicide is complex, but these tools aren't. So let me just give you a couple other things that we should and shouldn't do. We shouldn't be afraid to ask someone how they're doing in fear of how they're going to respond. We also shouldn't be afraid to ask someone that if a conversation gets there, to ask them if they're thinking about taking their life. Because data and research has shown us that even if we ask and we're wrong, that's okay, because we are not going to be implanting that idea into someone's head. I also don't want you to think that everyone that we interact with is on the brink of a mental health crisis. But let me ask you something. If you were at a restaurant and someone were to be choking on their food, I bet I know what all of you would do. You would probably use it as an opportunity to dine and dash, right? No, there would probably be a line of people ready to give that person the Heimlich maneuver. So you see, we have to respond to mental health crises the same way that we respond to physical crises. We also just can't expect that someone who is experiencing that emotional pain and in that mental health crisis, we can't expect that they're going to reach out to us. Because just like when you're in physical pain, that emotional pain clouds our ability to think. So we have to trust our gut, and we have to reach out. Even if we're wrong, that's okay. So if we can all just lend an ear to listen, and we can all lean into empathy, then we can all be suicide prevention experts, because suicide can be prevented. Oh, and Jasmine, by the way, that foster youth that I was talking about, she built a whole community of connections, and she just recently graduated with her master's. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.